Now on BBC4, a brand new profile for Remembrance Day explores the life of a writer and tank commander in World War II, whose work too often goes unremarked. Owen Shears traces the career of Keith Douglas, battlefield poet.
On October 27th, 1942, 4 days after the start of a battle which was to change the course of the Second World War, a British military officer took a momentous and dangerous decision.
From the safety of his cushy desk job 50 miles behind the front line, Lieutenant Keith Douglas could no longer bear it. Just 22 years old, he deserted his post, stole a lorry and drove towards Britain's biggest battle of the Second World War so far. His destination was a small railway junction. It was called El Alamein.
In the first few days of battle, his squadron had lost all its tanks, with all its officers either killed or wounded.
His return to the regiment surely was extraordinary. Well, you know, it took some guts, you know.
His corporal was impressed. "I like you, sir," he said. "You're shit or bust, you are." Stealing that lorry was probably the key moment in Keith Douglas's life. He was a man who, in many ways, was almost born to be a soldier, but it was his experiences at the front line that would make him Britain's finest poet of the Second World War.
When he picked up his pen, I mean, his integrity was absolute.
I don't think at that time that Keith really knew what important work he was writing.
As the poet of battle, the poet of war, he is by far the greatest.
When you start off in this fighting game, you're young, you're healthy, you're fit, you're optimistic, and you're convinced that anything that happens to anybody else, it won't happen to you. But unfortunately, this wears off. And the time comes when you realise that you're not an insurable risk.
Keith Douglas was an extraordinarily gifted writer and poet. He is arguably the literary link between the lyricism of the First World War poets and the unflinching knowing realism of the modern era. And yet today, he remains relatively unknown.
I'm really impressed by Keith Douglas's poetry because he finds a way through poetry to say many, many things at once in such a way that it both feels effortless and yet complex. As Ted Hughes says, he finds the path of the nerve under language. The language really penetrates.
I first read Keith Douglas over 10 years ago. As a poet myself, the craftsmanship and power of his work immediately captured my imagination. In this programme, I'm going to examine his extraordinary life and talent by meeting his friends and contemporaries and by following in his footsteps.
It is exciting and amazing to see thousands of men living in an unnatural, dangerous and not wholly terrible world, having to kill and be killed. It is tremendously illogical. To read about it cannot convey the impression of having walked through the looking glass which touches a man entering a battle.
My journey starts here in Leeds, where the university has a unique collection of Keith Douglas's family photographs and papers. I've come here to meet his biographer, the poet Professor Desmond Graham.
Well, he was actually born in Tunbridge Wells, but the first home was Cranley in Surrey. He was an only child.
Keith obviously had a fantastically strong relationship with his mother because his father quite simply wasn't there for much of his childhood.
The father couldn't really get a job and settle down after the First World War was over, where he'd served and got an MC.
But they had real difficulties, financial and work-wise. It turned out he wanted a divorce, and Keith never saw his father again. And I think that the kind of hurt he had had, and the fact that the person in the household who was most like him was his father, will have made a huge gap in his life. And the loss of his father meant that there was this complete knot of negative feeling, destructive, powerful emotion, which he had to try to deal with and cope with.
Once my mother was a wall. Behind my rampart and my keep in a safe and hungry house, I lay as snug as winter mouse, till the wall breaks, and I weep for simple reasons first of all.
How do I remember him now? Mainly very exciting to be with, but a very kind person, really.
In 1937, Brenda Jones first met Keith Douglas when he came to ride at her father's farm near Horsham in Sussex.
I think he was very bold. He'd try jumps, all sorts of things that perhaps he shouldn't have done, but that was Keith. Then it always had to go on to something else to prove himself. I'm always amazed that he had time to write anything, because he was always so busy learning about other things. So it all must have been going around in his head, mustn't it?
In 1938, Keith Douglas came to Merton College, Oxford, to study English. One of his contemporaries was the poet J.C. Hall.
He was a restless and difficult person in many ways. I mean, he was one of the best poets writing there. And he didn't mix all that much with what you might call the literary set. He preferred to be on the fringe of it and go out and do more masculine things, so to speak.
He fell completely and hopelessly in love with a Chinese girl about whom he wrote a couple of wonderful poems when he was in Oxford. And she was really much too sophisticated for him, an ambassador's daughter, and probably when realised that the going was getting a bit too heavy, she then dumped him. And he was heartbroken.
She said she'd only been kind to me because she thought I needed encouragement as an artist, and now I could go to hell. So I'm in the market again, in a very battered condition. Anyway, cheer up. Think how miserable I am and laugh merrily.
During the year before the war, life went on very much as it always did at Oxford, but of course there was this cloud in the background. Everybody knew that something was going to happen.
He started at 15, so by the time he got to Oxford, he had already actually got about 4 years of good writing behind him. As an undergraduate, he was very much involved in trying to develop a poetry which was involved in the tremor of the times, the war on the way, you're going to be called up, it's happening. A poetry, therefore, which is resonant with the times.
Well, I am thinking this may be my last summer of this hot time. What sudden fearful fate can deter my shade wandering next year from a return? Whistle, and I will hear. And come another evening when this boat travels with you alone toward Iffley as you lie looking up for thunder again. This cool touch does not betoken rain. It is my spirit that kisses your mouth lightly.
Well, I think they were very well shaped. They were very lyrical, beautifully poised as poems. It came very naturally to him. I don't think he had to slave at it. I mean, the early poems flow beautifully, I think.
While he was here at Merton, Keith studied under the writer Edmund Blunden, a man who became a friend, a mentor, and an enthusiastic supporter of his work.
As a friend of Siegfried Sassoon and a publisher of Wilfred Owen, Edmund Blunden had been instrumental in promoting the First World War poets in Britain.
A noted war poet himself, Blunden had been a decorated officer and had served on the front line of some of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. It was through the poetry of the First World War that many people in Britain would come to get their first insight into what it was really like to fight here on the front line. And even today, it's still a body of work that defines how we see that war.
War poetry was given a great deal of importance, and it was seen as nationalistic, heroic. And Rupert Brooke, "If I should die, think only this of me," even during the war, was very, very highly praised and lauded as combining beauty, youth, and death. Sassoon, even right through to this day, has been seen by some people as a kind of betrayal of a national cause, that in saying that the soldiers died and what did they die for is in some way a betrayal of the dead. So war poetry gets seen in England as being either poetry talking about the death of the hero and the greatness of the nation, on the one hand, or on the other hand, poetry talking about filth, mess, mud, horror, wounds, death, and what is the meaning of war.
But there was another soldier poet whose work, perhaps more than most, would anticipate that of Keith Douglas. His name was Isaac Rosenberg.
He wrote about the energy and the violent power of war, and particularly was, in his most famous poem, Dead Man's Dump, wrote about the dead bodies and the question of what is the move from life to death.
None saw their spirit's shadow shake the grass. All stood aside for the half-used life to pass out of those doomed nostrils and the doomed mouth, when the swift iron-burning bee drained the wild honey of their youth.
It's a very strange experience being here, because what you realise is that however much you learn about the First World War, however much you read about the scale of the casualties, just seeing the scale. I mean, this cemetery out here, these are just some of the men who died at Passchendaele, and there's 11,000 graves here. For me, there's a real anger about these deaths that just simply didn't have to happen.
In September 1939, Britain found herself yet again at war with Germany. As soon as he could, Keith abandoned his studies and joined up.
Dear Mr. Blunden, I shan't be coming up next term, being a cavalry trooper at the moment. If I am about when the war ends, or above ground, as the Colonel so neatly puts it, I hope I'll be back.
After his training, Keith was attached to the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry. In 1941, he was sent to the Middle East, where he met a fellow officer, John Semkin.
Well, he was quite an ordinary sort of chap. I liked him. He was nice, got on very well with him. The only trouble was that he was very liable to harbour resentments of one kind or another. He seemed to be plagued by this drive of creativeness, you know.
By 1942, Germany was advancing on all fronts. France had fallen, Germany had successfully attacked Russia, and Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, leaving North Africa as the only place where the British Army could directly take on the Germans in battle. Thousands of men, machines and equipment poured into Egypt, a vital hub for the war in North Africa.
At 21, Keith was an untravelled writer. He was hungry for experience. So imagine what it must have been like for him to arrive here in wartime Cairo, a place that offered him a treasure trove of new encounters, sights and sensations. Although Douglas always had the makings of being a good poet, because of his experiences here in Egypt, in just the space of a year, he went from being a promising young writer to probably the finest poet of the Second World War.
One of the writers who knew Keith Douglas in Cairo was Dr. Mercy Saad el-Din.
So here is one of Keith Douglas's poems in the 43 edition.
My God. This is really a precious collection.
It is incredibly precious because it was in this magazine, it's the first time that any of these poems
were published.
Exactly, you know, saw the light of day.
And to think that it was published in Cairo, you know, during the war.
Yeah, and published so well as well.
He must have been young at the time.
So he would have been 22, 23 when he was here?
Yes, I remember it.
I suppose you must have been quite young too, though.
Yes. Well, it started actually when I was still at the university. At that time, there was something called the Anglo-Egyptian Union. Although it's Anglo-Egyptian, there were very few Egyptians, more Anglo than Egyptian.
And what was the cultural scene like during the war?
The culture. In fact, I always called Cairo at the time London on the Nile. Theater, music, poetry, everybody came to Cairo.
And why do you think there was so much poetry being written in Cairo during the war?
Well, you know, poetry is always the best way to express feelings. And people were in a hurry to express feelings.
Did you ever get the chance to meet Keith Douglas?
Yes, I met him. He was one of the, in fact, one of the best poets of that period. There's no doubt.
In February 1942, Keith Douglas was posted to divisional headquarters as a camouflage training officer. A backseat job far away from the action.
Of course, Keith was very well set up, but the only trouble was that he didn't have enough work to do, because, to tell the truth, camouflage training comes very low on the list of an armoured regiment when it's preparing for war.
And was there much partying and drinking?
Oh my God, yes. The parties that were given for the British troops, I don't know, they put the war behind them. Somehow, leaving the Western Desert with its flies, its heat, and coming to Egypt, which was almost a paradise for them.
We went to the hotels in order to feed well, and went to the pyramids and the Sphinx and so on. I don't think he spared himself anything.
He'd always been something of a ladies' man, and on coming to Egypt, it wasn't long before Keith had racked up a string of girlfriends.
He managed very nicely for himself, thank you.
The first 9 months in the Middle East, he was really sort of meeting a number of girls, but none of them were really what he was looking for, because he was looking for the one. He was looking for the big romance, but happy to have plenty of people as friends or as lovers or whatever on the way.
But then one day he came here to Stanley Bay in Alexandria, where he met a woman with whom he very quickly fell deeply and passionately in love.
The woman he met was Milena Gutierrez Peña.
They had afternoon tea, and so eventually he asked permission to come and sketch me. Gradually, by knowing him, he told me all his worries. I was a good listener, I suppose, and gradually I appreciated him and fell in love with him, and we loved each other from then.
It was here that Keith and Milena would go out. They would have their tea over here at the Cecil Hotel, before cocktails at the Metropole Hotel, before going on for some dinner and dancing at the Monseigneur over there. It must have been an amazing time for Keith, and it's incredibly hard to understand why a young man would choose to leave all of this for the front line.
Then one day, Keith came back to find Milena alone with his best friend, Norman Eilert. It was clear she no longer felt the same way about him. Once more, Keith found himself dumped.
Can I explain this to you? Your eyes are entrances to the mouths of caves. I issue from wonderful interiors upon a blessed sea and a fine day. From inside these caves I look and dream. And in your body each minute I die. Moving your thigh could disinter me from a grave in a distant city. This, I think, happened to us together, though no shadow of it flickers in your hands. Your eyes look down on ordinary streets. If I talk to you, I might be a bird with a message, a dead man, a photograph.
How do you think the loss of Milena affected him, both as a man and perhaps as a poet?
In the poem The Knife, he writes about this, and if I look at you, I could be a dead man or a photograph. It wasn't only that he had lost a beautiful and attractive woman who really also was a good friend to him, but his reaction in these situations of feeling despair, being lost, being abandoned, his reaction was always action. And so I think it's not in any way simplifying to say that the loss of Milena gave him the reason to do what he had already been contemplating, but which was to basically steal his truck and drive himself off to battle.
El Alamein was the biggest battle fought by the British in the war so far. 300,000 men faced each other across the desert.
Lo and behold, Keith Douglas arrived. He'd simply scarpered from headquarters. There are not many people who would leave a safe job at division and go straight into the cannon's mouth like that. Of course, the colonel was quite pleased to see him.
But The regiment had already suffered some losses in terms of the officers, hadn't it?
Well, indeed, a squadron had had all its officers killed or wounded.
The Battle of Alamein was Keith's first battle, and standing here now, you can really appreciate what a difficult environment this must have been to fight in. It really was a trial by combat, and one in which Keith was desperate to succeed.
Keith arrived, put his kit on a tank, and was in business. He took to fighting like a duck to water. And very soon we found he was out of his tank, winkling Germans out of slit trenches with a rifle which he'd picked up and which didn't work, and reporting this to the colonel, who was mighty pleased. Of course, he had no right to be out of his tank. The trouble with them, he was erratic. I mean, he was this one-man band. I mean, he wasn't a team player at all.
My first few days in action were undeniably sticky, and the Germans fought as long and as well as they could. When they broke, the pursuit was very much like hunting in England, except that instead of killing the fox, we gave him a tin of bully beef and searched him for souvenirs. My worst day was spent in a tank full of someone else's blood. The flies were incredible.
In many ways, the Western Desert offered those who fought here a remarkably uncomplicated battlefield. There were no towns, no civilians, no refugees. Just the two armies facing each other across this incredibly desolate expanse.
Somehow we got through the Battle of Alamein, and it ended with a rather ghastly affair when 13 Italian tanks came over the crest, bolting for home for all their worth, and they ran into us and we were smashed. It was the first time I actually had an opportunity to inspect the damage that tanks do, and it was really quite pathetic. These chaps all had little pictures of the Madonna stuck on their walls with prayers and so on. Didn't do them a bit of good.
On the way, they saw terrible things and had some terrible fighting. But it meant that, therefore, the enemy were often a puff of dust in the distance, a group of prisoners of war, someone who was wanting a cigarette, someone who was a German in a gun pit dead with a copy of Goethe beside him. So that, as comes out in the poems, it's the fact that the civilian and the soldier are one. There's no separation. You don't go off as a conscript and become a soldier. You remain the lover. And he felt the same about the enemy. So the Germans and the Italians, they were lovers as well as soldiers.
3 weeks gone, and the competence gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again and found the soldier sprawling in the sun, the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Look, here in the gun pit spoil the dishonoured picture of his girl who has put Steffi, vergiss mich nicht, in a copybook Gothic script. We see him almost with content abased, and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt.
There's a very powerful line in one of Keith Douglas's poems where he talks about a shell hitting a tank being like the entry of a demon. Is that a line that rings very true for you?
Absolutely. You know, I often wondered just what a shell landing site was like, but it was exactly like that. It didn't go pop and it didn't go bang. It was just accumulated hatred. And the first time it gets you very close and you suddenly realise that this chap is trying to kill you. Yes, you. This is personal. And you feel like bursting into tears that anybody could be so unkind. But you get over it and then you carry on.
The 8th Army pursued the Germans and Italians all along the North African coast, until they came to a place called Wadi Zem Zem, where the Afrika Korps made a determined stand. It was the 15th of January 1943, and the Sherwood Rangers faced their bloodiest battle of the war so far.
We lost more tanks on that day than any other day in the war. And my tank was knocked out and the driver was killed and my co-driver died of burns. My operator and gunner were in hospital for 4 months. And I was badly burnt in the hand and face and so on. And Keith was knocked out. And he found himself on the ground. And then he set off a tripwire. And Keith was very badly wounded. And anyway, he was out of it for many months.
I had a hole in my right foot. There were bits of other metal or wounds in the calf of my right leg, in my left thigh and in the small of my back, under my left arm and in my left shoulder. The hair, eyebrow and moustache on the right side of my face were scorched away. Almost covered with dressings from head to foot, I looked vainly around for someone from the Army Film and Photographic Unit. After my whiskey and a hot tea, I felt thoroughly cheerful and ready to produce a traditional grin to go with my costume.
He probably wrote one of the best, if not the best, prose account of the fighting here in the Western Desert, a book called Alamein to Zem Zem, which basically detailed his own experiences of fighting from here right up to Tunisia. And it's an incredibly rich account, a visual account. It's remarkably funny in places, but it has that constant sort of truthfulness about it. It has that very, very honest eye.
Oh, I would say it was spot on. I'd say that Alamein to Zem Zem is probably the best book of its kind about the actual nature of what the fighting was like in the desert. I mean, when he picked up his pen, I mean, his integrity was absolute.
The Major, a very pleasant chap, said there was never time in a running battle to probe carefully for mines yard by yard, and the only thing to do was to drive along a road until you blew up. I got 5 miles before I went up, he said. It was the 3rd time he had been blown up. His driver had been killed, having had both legs blown off.
As soon as the fighting stopped, the regiment was in a total state of collapse. I mean, everybody that one knew had been killed. I mean, I could reel off their names even now. And chaps I used to laugh with. One was killed at Alamein and the other was killed at Zem Zem. And it just went on unceasingly. And of course, once your crew being killed is very upsetting because you live very closely with them. It becomes your family, you know. A pal of mine who was actually, he was blown to pieces all over me. It's only after a long time that it really catches up with you. but it does catch up in the end.
For him, writing came from life, and it needed to be fed by experience and fed. And so if you're going to write about war, you had to go and put yourself at risk. You had to be under a bombardment. You had to be there. And there was a pretense if you were trying to write about it from the outside.
It was here that Keith Douglas really became a soldier. It was also here that he truly found his voice as a poet. His experiences in the Western Desert would provide him with the material for his finest work.
Living in a wide landscape are the flowers. Rosenberg, I only repeat what you were saying. I look each side of the door of sleep for the little coin it will take to buy the secret I shall not keep. I see men as trees suffering or confound the detail and the horizon. Lay the coin on my tongue and I will sing of what the others never set eyes on.
His poetry changed very much with the war. I mean, compared with the Oxford poems, there's a complete change. They're much starker and rooted in what was going on.
In August 1943, Keith wrote a letter from North Africa to his friend J.C. Hall. It was a clear manifesto of what he was trying to achieve as a poet.
Incidentally, you say I fail as a poet when you mean I fail as a lyricist. Only someone who is out of touch with what has happened outside England could make that criticism. I don't know if you've come across the word bullshit. It is an army word and signifies humbug and unnecessary detail. It symbolizes what I think must be got rid of, the mass of irrelevances, of attitudes, approaches, propaganda, ivory towers, etc., that stands between us and our problems and what we have to do about them.
What was your reaction when you received that letter?
Well, it's almost 70 years ago now, so it's a bit difficult to recall it all, but I must have been slightly put out, I suppose. But it didn't take me very long to understand what he was saying. It defines what he's trying to do. It shows that he wants to go into the war with a completely clear, unsentimental view of everything.
My object, and I don't give a damn about my duty as a poet, is to write true things, significant things, in words each of which works for its place in a line.
Keith, as a poet, saw his task, really, as going in the deep end. And in that year, from being wounded through to Normandy, in that year, he wrote poems that no other British writer either had the opportunity or the talent or the insight to make. And as a result, there's no question that as the poet of battle, the poet of war, he is by far the greatest.
The surviving drafts of Keith's poems are held in the manuscripts collection at the British Library in London. What I'm looking at here is 15 drafts of probably what is one of Douglas's best poems, How to Kill. It's certainly a very strange experience to be sitting in front of these now, and to sit here above the pages that he actually wrote in his own hand, above the pages that he breathed over. It feels as though this is almost as close as I will ever get to him. And also because you're in that very intimate space of the writer's moment of writing. And it's an incredible journey. When you read through these in order, you really see the entire evolution of the poem. You see these lines being born. He obviously did have to work at it. You can see him really making each word work and searching, you know, for a right word that will bring a certain image, will bring an idea springing off the page. So in this draft, the first line of the second stanza still reads, "Now in my circle of glass appears." But there's something not quite right in the rhythm. And
Douglas identifies the weak word as being circle, and eventually, in the later drafts, that circle becomes a dial. In my dial of glass appears, which is a perfect change, not just because it's taking the word from 2 syllables into 1 so that the metre and the rhythm improves, but also the associations with dial as inside a tank. It's perfect for that part of the poem.
Now in my dial of glass appears the soldier who is going to die. He smiles and moves about in ways his mother knows, habits of his. The wires touch his face. I cry, now! Death, like a familiar, hears, and look, has made a man of dust, of a man of flesh. This sorcery I do. Being damned, I am amused to see the centre of love diffused, and the waves of love travel into vacancy. How easy it is to make a ghost.
It's still an incredibly contemporary poem. It's impossible not to think of those grainy images from unmanned drones, and, you know, this is still how people kill and how people die in war. I think it's a fantastic poem. I think it's a brilliant poem, and although it was written out of a very specific context, I think it completely resonates in our world now. At the end of 1943, after more than a year of heavy fighting and victory over Rommel, the Sherwood Rangers left Africa and set sail for England.
We were sent off on leave for a month. The whole regiment went on leave for a month. And then, of course, we started getting the good news. And we didn't bring you home to show off your medal, you know. You come home to breach Hitler's Western Wall. You, they said, will be amongst the very first troops to land in France.
And what was that like? I mean, how did the regiment feel about that? Because they must have felt that they'd already done more than
We said, thanks very much, you see. And they said, oh, and that isn't all. We're going to equip 2 of your squadrons with a very secret tank which had been modified so that it would swim in the sea. And we think, oh, yes, better and better. So, and this was in the dead of winter. You know, we hadn't seen a winter for 3 years, and it was a very cold winter that year, with snow and ice. And we went up to play with these DD tanks.
So he was facing the second front, the Normandy landings, although they didn't know where it would be. But they knew the big one was coming. He thought that he would be killed. He certainly was wise enough to know that it was better to work on that possibility rather than to take the risk of getting it wrong. If he wasn't killed, it would have been a nice mistake. He thought he'd be killed. He had an unknown number of months, and he came back and he worked like fury.
With the invasion imminent, Keith realised that he didn't have much time to get what was effectively his life's work into order. He embarked on a round of feverish activity.
And in a few weeks, he completed his Alamein to Zem Zem, did wonderful ink drawings for it, coloured pictures for it, had got a complete narrative, a complete collection of poems, did a cover for a collection of his poems, did illustrations for the poems. So it was basically all done. It was basically all done, all there.
When Douglas returned from Egypt, he spent much of his time making frequent trips into London to meet with Tamba Mutu, the publisher who promised to publish both Alamein to Zem Zem and his poems.
Well, he claimed to be a prince, which I don't think he was. But he was very engaging, but a bit scatty. But his heart was in the right place.
Douglas was not terribly impressed by his literary taste, was not terribly impressed by the likelihood of him actually managing to get the book out. But he had offered Douglas a contract, a publisher in hand, not long, he thought, before he went away, probably not much longer to live.
Dear Tamby, I don't know if you want the diary to publish or not, but will you please make up your mind by the 24th of March and let me know by then? I can't afford to wait because of military engagements, which may be the end of me. So that date is final. Yours, Keith.
He did try and cram everything in, because he always seemed to think that he was fated to be killed during the war anyway, so he wanted to get everything done before. Didn't say it in as many words, but you had that impression that he was rushing a bit.
A fellow officer and a close friend, John Bethel Fox, recalled that Keith didn't really rate his chances for survival.
I know from experience that one knows if one's going to be killed or not. Because I have met this a number of times during the war, and usually people who've had this feeling have been killed. And all his actions before D-Day prove this to me. I've no doubt in my mind.
On the evening of June the 5th, 1944, Keith sailed as part of the greatest invasion armada in human history.
And I've never seen anything like it. I mean, as far as the eye could see, there were ships everywhere, very closely meshed and very slightly moving along in huge numbers. This went on all night, and at 4 o'clock in the morning we could see the coast of Normandy.
Actors waiting in the wings of Europe, we already watched the lights on the stage and listened to the colossal overture begin. For us entering at the height of the din, it will be hard to hear our thoughts, hard to gauge how much our conduct owes to fear or fury. Everyone, I suppose, will use these minutes to look back, to hear music and recall what we were doing and saying that year during our last few months as people, near the sucking mouth of the day that swallowed us all into the stomach of a war. Now we are in it, and no more people. Just little pieces of food swirling in an uncomfortable digestive journey. What we said and did then has a slightly fairy tale quality. There is an excitement in seeing our ghosts wandering.
Well, A Squadron was due to land on H plus 30 minutes after H hour, which was 7 o'clock. By this time, the tide was running out and producing a huge beach. Gold Beach is absolutely enormous when the tide's out. And they landed successfully. But then the problem was getting off it. I mean, every minute that passed, more and more troops and more vehicles landed on this beach.
By the time Keith landed here, an hour and a half after the first wave, this beach was absolutely choked with scuttled vehicles and tanks and infantry all trying to get off the beach and up over this ridge inland.
And there was a gun in the concrete emplacement of this, which was knocking off our tanks, and until it was finally put out of action. And after that, there was only the problem of the mines. It took about 5 hours to get off.
And had the regiment suffered over those 5 hours in
well,
terms of casualties?
Well, the first 2 squadrons to land lost a third of their strength, either in the water or on the beach. But A Squadron was more fortunate and came through pretty well unscathed. And we got 10 miles deep into enemy territory on that first day, to the outskirts of Bayeux. And ultimately we got onto this high ground which commanded the valley beyond. And once we got there, we began to realise that this was not the sort of fighting we were accustomed to. In the desert we'd fought at anything up to 1,000 yards, but now we were fighting at 50 yards or 100 yards. And we didn't like it at all. And we hadn't got the hang of it one little bit. The country is called bocage, tiny little fields with very high hedges and very deep banks. It was ghastly.
2 days after landing in Normandy, Keith went on a reconnaissance mission with his fellow officer John Bethel Fox to scout out German positions in the village of Saint-Pierre in the valley below.
He took with him a great pal of his, John Bethel Fox, and the two of them went down to this village of Saint-Pierre and had the greatest difficulty in making contact with anybody, but they were all in the cellars, and they told them there were Germans in the village. But then next day, if you please, Keith and John Bethel Fox went off together, and they went without permission. And,
so they were on foot?
On foot, threading their way through these little fields.
We went off and did whatever we had to do, which was to try and identify some enemy movement. The other side of a small stream we were fired at. We had to get back as quickly as we could, and in the process he was slightly nicked in the leg by a bullet.
Keith got very jumpy on their way back.
But he knew then, I could feel it. He knew that his moment had arrived. And that's the first time I saw him scared. Paralyzed with fear. He was no longer in control of himself when this happened. And I'd never seen this before. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the day had come.
I suppose in a fairly typical way for him, he was off doing his own thing. He was sort of literally, carving his own path through the battle here. And it was while he was doing that that he was killed.
John got back, but Keith didn't. And what killed him, we don't know. So that was that, and that was the end of Keith Douglas.
So from what we can tell, it was just about here that Keith Douglas was killed on the 9th of June 1944 by a shell burst, quite possibly in these trees here.
It's difficult to express, but no other person has impressed me as he has. I find, even 30 years later, the loss is hard to bear.
He said, well, he reckoned he was really played out as a soldier. The bounce had gone out of him, I think, as it had gone out of me too, I don't mind telling you.
however much you know his story and you know how it ends, you're seeing it all there, just written on the gravestone. It really does, you know, it just brings it back with incredible power, especially seeing his age, 24. In that last year of writing in and about the war, you just feel that he learnt more in that year than most writers will learn in their entire lifetimes. And it's impossible for it not to feel like a waste.
He had the highest of ambitions about his own work. He didn't want to see himself as a Wilfred Owen or an Isaac Rosenberg, because they were killed in war. He didn't want to be killed in war. He wanted to be the greatest writer of his generation, of his century. He knew that he could write great things. So in his mind, even at the age of 23, he's only a beginner. It's only just, this is where I'm starting. But he was faced with a situation where, knowing that he could be a long-distance runner, he had 100 yards. And he was going to get to that finishing tape and win that 100 yards.
Standing here now, it's impossible not to think of his poem, Simplify Me When I Am Dead, Remember Me When I'm Dead. And partly because in that poem he talks about the people who will consider him in the future. And so it's strange, I feel as though I'm fulfilling sort of part of that dialogue. I'm doing exactly what Keith said that we would, and when he almost, well, he does, he tells us to leisurely arrive at an opinion and to decide what kind of a man he was.
Remember me when I am dead, and simplify me when I'm dead. As the processes of earth strip off the colour and the skin, take the brown hair and blue eye, and leave me simpler than at birth, when hairless I came howling in as the moon came in the cold sky. Of my skeleton perhaps so stripped, a learned man will say, he was of such a type and intelligence. No more. Thus, when in a year collapse particular memories, you may deduce from the long pain I bore the opinions I held, who was my foe and what I left, even my appearance, but incidents will be no guide. Time's wrong-way telescope will show a minute man 10 years hence and by distance simplified. Through that lens see if I seem substance or nothing, of the world deserving mention or charitable oblivion. Not by a momentary spleen or love into decision hurled, leisurely arrive at an opinion. Remember me when I am dead, and simplify me when I am dead.
There's more poetry next Thursday as Billy Connolly and Alamein go in search of the Scottish poet Norman McCaig. That's here at 9. And coming up next tonight, more war poetry with Jeremy Paxman and a remembrance tale for Wilfred Owen.